Good evening to, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good night, depending on the time of day that you are viewing this video. But for the purposes of these actual committee meetings, good evening to all the City Council committees for July 13th. For all three committees, you will each be doing the same exercise with regard to our preliminary American Rescue Plan Act investment ideas. This is simply the first public discussion council members will be holding with each other and with the public. Again, these are only preliminary investment ideas as proposed initially by staff. We expect that our recommendations will be discussed, debated, deliberated, adjusted, um, changed, edited. There will be items added to it, items deleted from our recommendations, and so forth. So what we expect and ask of the committees for July 13th is that each committee begins the discussion about these preliminary investment ideas, and then you forward the discussion outcomes to the full city council for further deliberation at the end of July. And then we'll bring it back in September and you will begin to make actual decisions then. So a couple of things we want to remind folks of. First and foremost, we certainly hope that this process will be a positive one throughout, even though the choices are all good. The difficulty will be in choosing what actually to invest in versus all the other needs that we have across the community. Second, it's important to keep in mind that this particular bucket of federal funding is intended for, and in the name itself is the American Rescue Plan, is intended specifically to help local governments, in our recovery from the COVID pandemic. And I want to emphasize that because, as we've discussed in prior council meetings, there have been literally boatloads of funding made available from the federal government as well as the state government, much of that also directed through the county government for different sectors of society and different sectors of the economy. As I record this presentation, prior to the July 13 committee meetings, there are no less than 5 federal infrastructure bills being negotiated in Washington. We hope and expect something to come from that, and we expect there will be, although we don't know the precise amounts and how it will be divvied up and in what categories, but we certainly hope there will be new federal stimulus dollars specific to infrastructure. We know that they are debating surface street infrastructure as well as water and sewer infrastructure. Those are the primary ones, and also related to surface and street infrastructure is also bridges, tunnels, and so on. So again, there's a lot of money that has come from the federal government. We are hopeful and expecting for more, again, specifically having to do with public infrastructure, as well as more funds coming from the state of California. I've reviewed these before, but let me quickly talk about California's buckets of money for families and small businesses. There we're looking at $8.1 billion. Again, this is forthcoming from the state for stimulus checks to individuals and families with kids. $5.2 billion to help low-income renters pay 100% of their back rent. There's $1 billion slated for new grants to workers who lost their jobs during the pandemic. There should be up to $12 billion set aside specifically to tackle homelessness. There's obviously been, and we're still in the midst of, a homeless crisis across California. I am certainly hopeful that those funds will be made available directly to cities versus via long and tedious grant processes, given that the homeless crisis the explosion of it occurs on city streets, in city parks, and so on. There is, for infrastructure, the state is setting aside a total of $18 billion for broadband infrastructure as well as modernizing the transportation system. And there are other buckets of money forthcoming from the state: $2 billion for emergency preparedness investments, $3.2 billion for accelerating zero emission vehicle goals, $1.3 billion for investing in preparing for extreme heat, sea level rise, as well as environmental justice priorities, and $5.1 billion set aside for drought response and water resilience. So this is all a reminder, again, that there are other buckets of money that have been made available and that will be made available both from the federal and the state government. So as we make choices about how to invest our ARP funding, which is approximately $59 million between this year and next year in terms of when we receive the funding, again, keep in mind that there are other sources of funding available for many of the projects and for many of the needs that we have here in our city. Next thing to keep in mind is the ARPA funding is one-time funding. It's a unique opportunity for us as well as all cities in America who are getting this funding, but it should be applied towards one-time expenditures. There are always a few exceptions, but as a general rule, one-time funding should be used for one-time expenditures. Fourth is philosophically how we want to approach this. Do we want to make one or two large investments, or do we do our best to spread it across the very many needs that we have here in the city? I tend to recommend that we do the latter, again, because we have so many needs across this community. And then finally, as we make the choices, we should look towards making investments in items that not only aid in the local government's recovery from the COVID pandemic, but also have the ability to provide improvements and growth in the future. Okay, so what are the 6 broad categories that the ARP funds, according to the federal bill, want to focus on? And they are: 1, support public health response; 2, replace public sector revenue losses; 3, invest in sewer and water infrastructure; 4, address the negative economic impacts from the pandemic as well as the pandemic-related recession; 5, provide premium pay for essential workers, something this council has already acted upon; and finally, invest in broadband infrastructure. Now, what we have so far from the U.S. Treasury are what they call the preliminary final rule. So we've studied those and we've done our best to make recommendations to you that we believe fit into not only the broad categories, but also comport to the rules that we have seen so far. The U.S. Treasury is, however, expected to issue its final rule in August. So we won't have the final rules until then. Now, one thing they've made clear is they've spelled out a few uses that are ineligible, and those include using ARP funds for debt service, for legal settlements or judgments, for deposits to pension funds, or to sock away into a reserve, i.e. our rainy day fund. So those are very specific categories where the feds have already said we cannot use these funds. So how did we come about the recommendations that you have before you? It's included as an attachment in the staff report. It's a little bit lengthy. I'm obviously not going to show it on this presentation. That would not be useful or effective. Everyone can refer to the actual published staff report and look at the actual list. So we did our best to balance, first of all, what we believe all the needs are that we have that would fit into these 6 categories and comport to the preliminary final rules. We also tried to fit them in terms of wherever we could, if they met council priorities, if whether or not there are alternative funding sources, whether recent or near future, uh, whether they meet specific unique needs in our community and for our population, whether the project can be implemented within the time frame of ARP funding. And essentially, we've got several years. We can discuss all that in more detail. We've got several years to encumber and expend these funds, not too many years. I think the ultimate deadline is 2026. And also, what would be the return on investment? In other words, what would we get out of it? Is it what is the longevity in terms of the impact that the investments might have? And also, we try our best to keep to the notion that it should be for one-time expenditures. So in the list that you will see, we have a total of almost $89 million of proposed investments. Again, these are all preliminary, and everything is up for discussion by the public and the council. And then, in addition, there's in the appendix an attachment of a list of potential items that didn't make it onto the list of recommended investments. And so you can see what I guess an easy way to mention it is the leftover list. And that list actually totals an approximate $169 million. So as you can see, we have much, much, much more need across the community than the ARP funds can provide for. But again, it's $59 million that several months ago we didn't have at all, and we certainly didn't expect, and we certainly didn't know whether any of it would come through. Now, the most important thing I want to mention, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, the City Council, once you hear public input, once you have the opportunity to think this through, each of you, and then once you have your conversations with each other, both at the committee level and then on July 29th as a one body, it's completely your prerogative to make any additions, deletions, or changes to any of these recommendations. Again, we did our best to balance it out. However, the council obviously plays a different role than staff, and there may be a very different balance of needs and desires for this community that you have a much, much, much better perspective and insight than we do on staff. So I want to make that clear, and this is why we're calling this report a discussion about the preliminary investment ideas. They are indeed just that, preliminary. Everything is open for discussion, debate, and deliberation. We certainly hope for all of that. So after all the committees discuss, what staff will do is we'll collect essentially the outcome of each committee. Hopefully at each committee's meeting, some key themes will percolate to the top. We certainly hope so. Or in addition, perhaps key factors to think through or key questions that are asked. So we'll percolate all of that information and put it into a report for the full City Council discussion on July 29th. We consider that to also remain preliminary because it will be the first time that the council as a body has a joint discussion and deliberation. Also, as a reminder, yet again, we expect the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury's final rules not until August. We don't know if that means the beginning, the middle, or the end of August. We are told August. So once we get those rules, we will study them to see if there are any significant changes that would impact the discussion from the July 29th City Council meeting. And we'll bring that all back in September, and you can begin to make actual investment decisions starting in September. So with that, I want to thank you for anyone who's sat through this brief presentation. The list of preliminary investment recommendations are available in the published staff report. Highly encourage everyone to take a look at it. You should notice that under the the 6 various categories, there's should be a blank line, a blank row that says other. That is intended to make it clear that council members can add items as they see fit. We all look forward to the preliminary initial discussions on July 13th, and then the collective entire city council discussion on July 29th. Thank you. The end. Fin. Finito.